Now in part three, we'll use workflow, and that way we can use that to automate metadata and some of the notifications that we typically do via email and some other systems.
In workflow. All right. Workflow is a bit of a different monster, if you will. Similar in many respects, but it does a lot of different things. So the toolbar, or the toolbox, if you will, is a lot more comprehensive. It contains a lot more items that you can do things with. I would say that probably workflow is a little more on the technical side. Forms, you can probably pick up the basics, with a little bit of use. Workflow, I find even myself, I have to, check with Laserfiche documentation on things quite frequently just to make sure that I'm using it in the proper manner, or that I understand sort of what they're looking for in a configuration step. So certainly don't feel bad if this is above your heads, because oftentimes it surpasses myself or Chris's.
Yeah,
Yep.
The one caution around workflow, and Sean, I don't know, lost half a day trying to fix that mistake I made.
Yes.
Because I had thought I'd figured it out and was modifying a workflow that Sean had built, and defined it as an infinite loop. So I had somehow managed to tell workflow to, instead of taking the item in the dropdown, to take all items in the dropdown and create a new instance for each one of those. So our workflow server quickly went from doing one process to, I think by the time we figured out what it was, I think it was 350,000. Was that what the number was?
Yes, that's when I eventually killed the process and had to terminate all of those, which was a fun sort of discovery and fix. But those are some of the gotchas that get people.
So never design at 4:45 at night.
That's right. That's the trick. So this, as you can see, comparative to the forms process layout, already, at least in my opinion, looks a lot more complex, right? It's not as pretty looking as forms because it's a little less modern, but additionally, it has a lot more sort of meat and potatoes to it. So in our specific scenario, what we've designed is using that same branch of data. If I'm in the test user that we just created, and this person has decided that they are going to retire, you'll notice that one of the items, I think
benefits.
It's
red ones.
Is it benefits? Yeah. Okay. The benefits folders have an option here for employee status. So typically, I'll just save these as active for right now. Typically, you'll see that this is an active item, and in our scenario, we want to change them to a retired status and have something happen. So again, under human resources, we have facilities, we have IT, we don't have anything else. It'd be nice if we had, let's say, a retired folder that moved everything that is associated with an employee to the retired folder when they retire. So we're going to go ahead and do that to this person here. And we'll just set them to retired. And we'll go ahead and save our changes. Some of the more observant of you may have noticed I'm checking both pink documents. This is another gotcha just because of the simplicity that I put into the workflow. I initially had it so that, and this will make more sense as we get into it, I initially had it so that it looks essentially at this folder. If it sees one that is set to retired, move the stuff to retired. But if you only change one of them, then one of them says active and one of them says retired, and I got into a loop similar to Chris, where it went into a folder and said, oh, there's a retired guy, moved all the content to retired, and then it said, wait, there's some active stuff here, moved it all back to active, and it just kept ping-ponging for, I think I hit close to 300,000 instances as well that I had to then terminate. But that's easily solved by simply checking both items. So I'm going to go back to workflow here. Actually, let's see what that has done. So if we look at human resources now, immediately we see a retired folder suddenly exists. If we go into there, we see the test user has been created or moved, if you will. And in there, the two documents we checked, in addition to all associated documents that were not checked, were moved there. Essentially, everything within the test user folder has moved to retired. So now we can see that all of their documents are grouped and associated, but they're not sort of in our way if we're doing things with active users. So let's take a look at sort of how that came to be. So on here, you start essentially with a blank slate, which looks just like this. It's got a start, it's got an end, and it's got activities in the middle, which you get from this left-hand toolbar. It's fairly well sorted. There's also a search option at the top. So if we were designing this brand new out of the box, we would say, well, first thing we want to do is we want to find something. So I type the word find. Oh, immediately there's a find entries option or a search repository option. Those are some avenues for finding things. So in our case, I believe we use the search repository. Yep. And some of this is trial and error as well.
Yeah,
you'll
exactly.
try one and find it doesn't fit your model exactly. And there is some descriptions on the side here as to what they do.
And I think one of the things that we sort of have learned, and we would suggest, as you're doing this, build it again. You've probably heard me say this a couple times already. Build it iteratively. So one of the things that we started off was because we knew we were looking for documents was find entries. What we found through trial and error of building a small workflow that was just literally designed to find the entries was that find entries doesn't do exactly what we thought it would do. Then Sean did some detective work using Laserfish answers and found out that, it's because find entries is a little more literal than you'd like. So
it's a little more focused, yeah. So I think in our scenario, we wanted to move all of the items, not just the items we checked. So in our scenario, find entries would only find a subset of the things we wanted, which is why we went with the more broad scope of search repository. And again, while that may, if you're sort of looking big picture, seem intimidating, like, I really don't want, like, how much time is it going to take to search a whole repository for content that as a human, I know exactly where it is and how big it is. Like, it's almost easier for me just to drag the folder. So you can't think like workflow is going to be bogged down, because workflow is sort of, it thinks at the speed of a computer, right? So searching the repository doesn't really matter how big your repository is. It is going to take milliseconds comparative to a human. And likewise, you could have 5 people changing statuses for people and have all of that happen in an instant versus 5 individual worker pace things occurring. So similar to sort of forms, you drag things from the left side toolbar into the action pane, if you will, and then you configure them on the right side. And this is sort of where I would say workflow gets a little more technical. So what do you want to search Laserfish for? And again, this is something that you can test here. It'll tell you how many entries it's going to find. Go ahead and take a look at what we configured here. So this is all very confusing. I don't fully understand it either. I mean, it looks semi-English in terms of I could determine what it's sort of looking for. But in terms of knowing how to, what to put in this box, there's sort of some quick and simple cheats for that. I appear to have closed my repository window, but let me get that. Oh, no, I still have it. It's just hiding. So for instance, if you wanted to do search the repository, you could choose the advanced option. And we say that we want to find within a specific folder. We want to select a folder. So we know that all of the things that I care about are going to be under government human resource. We say, okay, I want to include subfolders because it's not going to be users at the root of that. It's going to be within their department's subfolder. I can specify what templates apply to it and all sorts of other good stuff. But essentially, if I want to find everything, I can just click this search or show search syntax, and it'll show me the building blocks of what compiles this search. So I can go ahead and tweak this search to my heart's content with no impact until it finds the files that I want. So this is finding too many, right? So I want to do that again, and I can keep tweaking and tweaking. So I want to do within there. I want to do a search for a specific field. Where is that one again? Field. So I want things that have the benefits and payroll template, where the employee status is set to active or retired, let's say in our case. So if we go here, show search syntax, you'll see that this search has grown, etc. So I essentially tinkered around in here until I found the files that I actually wanted to manipulate, and then I grabbed the search criteria in it, and this is again a generalization, not a specific, like I want to find a file named Sean Old Top Benefits. I want to find, in our scenario, I want to find a file where this criteria is met. So I then take this search syntax and go ahead and close out of here for right now. And I can just dump that literally right into this box here. So if I recall correctly, it's making sure that it has the template, which in our case is number 16. It's looking only in this folder, and I think it's looking for type of directory. And I want to return all the results. So it's going to find me everything that's in that folder that is the D might actually be document, now that I think about it. Finds all of the documents that are in that folder that have the template of benefits. And what do we want to do with those? We want to do in a loop, we want to determine what their status is and move them accordingly. And again, this grew dynamically. So initially, when I started this, I said, where's it here? Close off this.
And I think the key, as you're trying to think about how you want to do it, is one of the things that we do is we banter things off each other to try and figure out what is the computer language that matches how I would look for it if I was telling you how to do it. And I think often when Sean and I started trying to build this, the steps of how we build a process, which is a weird way to say it, it's very hard because Sean, being a developer, can speak tech, and me being not a developer, I don't necessarily speak tech really well. So we had to figure out what that language was that would let me explain it. So we use a lot of whiteboards. I have 2 whiteboards, and they're always constantly filled, and we're always with diagrams. So I would caution, while Sean's first step is to go into here, I think until you're real comfortable with the language of it, and you can, and in the context of your head, can see each one of these things, I think you want to build it out on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper, and then start to do that one-to-one mapping of, okay, this can be done in Laserfiche using one of these 4 things, and then just building it out that way from a build perspective. Because the one problem I found is that if I start off in here in the workflow designer and try and build it out here without having that paper version or that version which is in my English, I have a hard time finding out what the right box is and the right tools are, because they're not always it's not always as intuitive within the workflow designer as I think it should be. So you need to give yourself a crib sheet to kind of work off of. Exactly.
And again, I mean, I'm going up to the toolbar at the top here. Let me get rid of that. And I kind of know, based on having used it a while, what I'm looking for. But I mean, first-time users or even myself in some cases, I'm like, I know what I want to do, but what is the Laserfiche word for it, right? So their context search is pretty decent for workflow. So if I type in loop, I'm going to get things, or if I want to iterate, I think pulls it. So I mean, there's a lot of variations that you can put in here if you've got a rough concept even of what you want it to do. So I mean, in my mind, I'm already looking at this workflow from a bare bones perspective. Let's say we don't have all the other options in terms of retired, on medical leave, on non-medical leave. If we just want to talk about, I want to find a bunch of documents. If they're retired, I want to move them. I might not even think about a loop at this point, right? So I want to find some stuff. I want to do some stuff with it. So this box evolves over time to the point where you start adding more and more things to it and configuring each item as you go, till eventually you end up with a scenario similar to this. So I think you get the concept of take the item from here, put it on here, configure it here. we don't need to step through that for this whole process. But the gist of what we ended up with that actually functions, which is what you saw moving that document when we changed that metadata, is it searches the repository using a specific search syntax for each entry that it finds, essentially. So the output of whatever this discovers, it's going to do whatever sort of behind the for each. So within this yellow box is what's going to happen to each entry. So it's going to check the employment status. And it basically, again, this is a conditional, this is somewhere on the box here, conditional decision. So if it matches one of these criteria, it's going to do something with it. So in our scenario, if it's active, it's going to do nothing. If it's retired, it's going to move to retired. And each of these, again, are configured. We say, I only want to talk to items that are retired and that are in that are not already in the retired folder. Just because we made this a very high-level basic search, I have to add that exclude in there. I could also do that a different way. That's the other nice thing about workflow. There's sort of 50 ways to skin a cat, if you will.
Not that we're advocating skinning cats.
Right. Yes. Don't do that. So in here, I've set it in the sort of in the end goal. So I find a lot more stuff than I need, and then I sort of whittle it down as I need to. I could also sort of flip this pyramid and find specifically what I need. In my search, I could say and where it does not equal retired and a number of other things here, which grows the complexity of this box, but eliminates the need for some of the complexities later on. So in our scenario, it is following the one path, and you can build this a piece at a time, right? So we could have search for each entry found, check the status. If it's retired and matches these criteria, move it to a folder, and we've simply specified here to move it to that specific folder. And there's some action items you can do as a result. You can have it copy only. You can create shortcuts. You can have it copy just the files. In our case, we did the parent folder so that it moves everything, including other content that's not got the same template, etc. You can have it tweak metadata at the same time if you have a different template that applies to retired people, or any other scenario you can envision. You can tag things. You can send an email notification saying, finance, don't forget to process so-and-so's benefit package now that they've retired. You can add, all sorts of things of that nature. You can have wait conditions. So if there's a specific file you're waiting on before this transpires, like their retirement letter or resignation letter or something, until that is in the box, this step doesn't actually occur. When you put that in there and name it a certain way, now all of a sudden this workflow can complete. So it sort of sits there in a waiting state. There's a lot of configuration options. So you could initially build it with just one chain, test it. If it works, you just sort of rinse and repeat these stages for different things. And that's essentially how this evolved from, like I say, gathering information from the end user or client, to Chris's physical whiteboard, to us sort of conversing on, is this the best way to do it? How does this look in Laserfeast language? To what can we do with forms versus what can we do in workflow? And similarly, that grew into this sort of process here. So as I said, workflow is sort of a lot to take in at a first glance because it's got a lot more meat and potatoes. But does anybody have any general questions or specific questions?
Can you show specifically how not to create an infinite loop?
Well,
just as there's an offside there, can you do that?
Yeah, certainly. So in our scenario, initially I had stuff under active. I basically copied. I think I started with retired, and I had the same step under here. So I think you can just copy that. Paste, and then I had it go into a different place. So if it was an active or occasional, I moved it to active. And as I said, because I only tweaked the one file and I didn't have the not equal to the active folder or not not equal to retired already, it literally just kept going down the loop it would hit this one, move it, and then it would go down the loop, and it would hit this one and move it, and then go. It just kept doing that. So it's simple enough to do, but it's easy enough to find as well.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's lots of ways to do infinite loops once you start getting into that for each language. So when you have multiple options of what could happen, that's when you start to really increase the chance of those infinite loops. I think that's the key there is, when you're doing that initial, you keep everything binary. The more, because you got to remember that workflow is in some ways very stupid. It only does what you tell it to do. It doesn't go, well, that doesn't make any sense to do because I've already done X. So anytime you can make the workflow not have to think is a good chance that you're avoiding infinite loops. So in a perfect world, would we have a workflow that had 4 or 5 or 6 across? Probably not. You'd want to keep it to 1 or 2 if you can. If you can't, you want to just make sure that as you're looking at how it kicks off, what are the conditions that it's looking for, making sure that those conditions are binary themselves, right? So that it's all about sort of that QC, and that's why I was, when I was pointing out the fields and how we have reused fields. When we're building out the workflow to kick something off based on a metadata change or a field change of any kind, whether that's date or something like that, we want to make sure those are unique fields to that template that will allow the workflow to have a limited number of things to do. So rather than having, for example, the current employee status, we wouldn't want to use it for anything else, because then all of a sudden workflow, if one of those documents ends up in the folder, may end up moving all of somebody's documents to a new folder simply because it's just going to do what it's been told to do.
Thank you.
So that's really all I have to show. So if you've got any more questions, certainly fire away, and otherwise I'll hand it back over to Chris.
I'm just going to go back to the question I asked earlier when we were in forms. And how do you export that data that you enter into forms into, say, Excel or some other format?
Right. So I'm not exactly sure in terms of Excel specifically. I know there is a way. I just, at the top of my head, I can't think of it. But there are a number of export options here. So you could take, let's actually go to a different workflow here. So let's. So we can take information from forms. Is it not that? Where is it here? Process, tokens, retrieve business value. Okay, so Laserfish has some interesting naming conventions where in sort of one series of documents they call something forms and business processes, and then in workflow they only call it as business processes. So there is a little bit of nuance in terms of figuring out what they're referring to when they refer to it. So in our case, we would have the forms as part of our build process for forms, which I think I have now closed.
If you use the timesheet one, that'll be more of a data one. Sean?
The timesheet one? Okay.
Yeah. Or the water main replacement are both data heavy.
Are you talking workflows or forms right now?
Forms.
Forms, okay. Yeah, just give me 1 sec here then. I'm just waiting for forms to reload.
Well, you can get it on the server side, right? So if you show them within workflow, on the right-hand side, nope. Workflow 2, right-hand side.
Yep. The invoke you want?
Nope. If you just go to on the right-hand side under retrieve business process, load up.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So forms. So in our case, we have another option for. So in our case, let's go with the new hire just so that we have recognizable data.
Yeah.
We can tell it that when a form is submitted, we want to go grab some of that data. There is some other stuff we'd have to configure on the form side to actually tell this workflow to run. but there's certainly, that's fairly simple as well. So assuming that Forms has already told this workflow to run, we can retrieve some things from the fields. So we've said, I want to get business process variables from the Forms server. Again, this is just how does it connect to your Forms server. Fields, I want to specifically take it from here, this specific form. And then when I click on this lower part, it knows all the fields that are on that form, including the one that we added while we were at the beginning of the demo. So if I only wanted to pull employee birth date and employee name, I could do that at this level. And these are field labels, which in turn turn into tokens within workflow. So if we go to tokens, so there's sort of two steps, and this is where it gets into what Chris was talking about earlier, knowing sort of English and knowing Laserfish workflow as two sort of separate languages. So from an English perspective, you want to take something that somebody has input on a form, and you want to do something with it. In Laserfish speak, you need to retrieve those variables, and then you need to put them somewhere. So we're going to assign tokens to those. And you can create, and we want to set that value to one of the items we retrieved. So in our case, it now knows, because in the earlier step we retrieved them, it now knows about these two items, and these are ones that just exist all the time. So if we set employee birthday, and we add another one, we have to do them individually. Where are we here? Create and name. So now essentially we have taken stuff that was entered on a form, we've put it into a token, and now we want to do something with it. So I'm just seeing here, Excel's not there. Export maybe. I know you can put stuff into PDFs, emails, and Word docs now. I don't know specifically about Excel.
Excel.
But you're talking about for purposes of essentially taking something someone's entered on a form and getting it into a usable format for another product, right? Like a non-Laserfish product. That's your sort of use case?
Yes, that's what we're thinking. So we could have it maybe automatically uploaded to our payroll system or...
Right. So in off the top of my head, I don't think I could just sort of like, throw that together for you. But there is an option for an Sdk script, which allows for custom code to be run. So this allows for either C# or Visual Basic, and I think JavaScript as well. Oh, no, sorry. They've taken that off of workflow. It's only in Forms. But yourselves, if you have a developer in-house, you could have them run a script that does specific things, or we can do that in-house here as well.
Could you send it to SQL using stored procedures? Or is
you
that
could, and then have SQL do an auto export. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways to do it, but it's not something I could throw together sort of in the time frame of our demo for sure. But definitely the most complex way to do it would be with an Sdk script. So we've obtained the variables we want, and you can have an Sdk script either create a CSV, or if your accounting software, for instance, has some sort of programming interface, usually called an API or an SDK, this could directly import into that. You wouldn't even necessarily need that stopgap of putting it into a CSV and then uploading it in. It could just simply speak directly if your software so supports. And like Chris said, there's other options as well. You could have this insert data into. Maybe we can actually choose from here. Data source. So you can do an ODBC connection to an Excel file. I think it'll let you do Excel. I don't have any data sources installed on this specific server, but you could download a data source driver, or have a developer or ourselves put some data source drivers in that will write to Excel. Essentially, those are just sort of language interpreters that say, how do I take content and make an understandable content for Word or Excel or something else. So there would be the ability to do that as well.
Okay. Yeah, we're more just wondering about its abilities.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, as I say, like some of these things, a lot of times workflow in particular, forms a little less so, but workflow specifically, a lot of this gets whiteboarded out on Chris's whiteboards and erased multiple times before we sort of harden down a solution that we then have to attempt in the actual system. And sometimes sort of our ideal physical whiteboarded thing is simply either not possible or the complexities are too much to put into a system. We have the choice of rewriting the physical whiteboard process to better accommodate Laserview's workflow, or putting a lot of time and effort into a development build to make workflow do what we want. So there's some balance to be had for sure.
Diane, do you have anything? I have one kind of quick question. I'm just wondering, when we publish the workflow, does it make it automatically happen in the client, or is there anything we need to do on the client side?
On the client side, no.
Okay.
So what I did in the client was simply select those items and change the metadata, and then have them actually do something.
But maybe go to that initial step.
Yeah, so on the workflow side, so I'm just going to discard our changes there. There is a what starts this item to happen. So they're called starting rules. So for our specific move files, when metadata is changed, example, we have created and there's a whole wizard for it as well. So we've gone ahead and created several start things. So whenever an entry is changed, if these conditions are true, so if it's a document, if it includes a template, and you specify here what that template is. So in our case, I had specified the benefits template, and the user does not equal workflow, because you want to sort of eliminate workflow from working over top of itself. I'm not sure why that's not sort of defaulted in there, but I guess there's scenarios where you might want workflow to do things twice. Either way, so these are the start entries that cause this thing to occur. And then you just publish this, and it publishes with the workflow to say anytime something happens to an entry, so in this case change. And there's a lot of other options as well. So if you wanted every time a document got created in your repository for something to happen, you would set it to that and then set your criteria as such.
Okay. Anything else?
No, I'm good.
Okay, I think we're good for questions here for now.
Yeah, it's a lot to absorb, and as Chris said, he'll send you this presentation as well. So if you've got further questions down the line, we're certainly available.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.